Hey everyone! Tonight, we're stepping into the life of a man who didn't conquer the world with certainty, but reshaped it with doubt. He never built an empire, never led a nation, never even raised his voice. And yet, his questions bent the atom, divided the stars, and quietly rewrote reality. Niels Bohr. Before we get started, go ahead and hit like and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy thoughtful storytelling like this. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, and what the sky looks like outside your window tonight. I love seeing which corners of the world we're quietly connecting across. Now, settle in. Maybe dim the lights, let the background noise fade, and breathe slow. Because tonight, we're drifting through time. From a quiet boy in Copenhagen to a classroom orbiting Earth in the year 2123, and into the quiet mystery that never stopped flickering, deep inside the atom. He was born on a rainy October day in 1885, in a city that hummed softly with bicycles and bells. Copenhagen, the capital of Denmark, was no scientific metropolis then, no epicenter of revolution. But nestled in a tall, narrow house on Stockholm's Gata Street was a family destined to change the world. The Bohr family. His father, Christian Bohr, was a physiology professor at the University of Copenhagen. His mother, Ellen Adler Bohr, came from a wealthy Jewish banking family, known for their cultural patronage and intellectual salons. The home was both rigorous and tender, a place where questions were not just allowed, they were expected. Christian believed in precision. Ellen believed in beauty. And little Niels Bohr, shy and intensely inward, carried both forces in his soul. He was the second child. His older sister Jenny would become a teacher. But it was with his younger brother Harold that Niels formed a bond so deep it nearly defied language. They were not twins, but their minds moved in tandem. In play, they devised logic puzzles. In silence, they seemed to share thoughts. Voiceover. Jim Al-Khalili once said, "Even as a boy, Bohr asked the questions we're still asking today. He didn't just want to know how things worked, he wanted to know why they were allowed to work at all." In their childhood garden, Niels and Harold would spin wooden tops and watch them wobble on the stone path. Most children saw a toy. Niels saw a problem in rotational symmetry. He'd stare until the world blurred, and yet he rarely spoke. His teachers noted his awkwardness. He mumbled. He avoided eye contact. But he excelled in mathematics and physics, not in the sense of rote learning, but in his raw absorption of principles. He seemed to absorb rules, then quietly test their edges. It was not the boom of thunder that fascinated Niels. It was the pause between strikes. At age 10, he watched Christian, his father, draw fluid dynamics diagrams at the dining table. The lines rippled like wind on water. That night, Niels tried to replicate them using ink and a spoon in the bathtub. He was obsessed, but never flamboyant. His earliest notebooks reveal a peculiar pattern. In the margins, he would scribble imagined dialogues between concepts. One line read, "If energy cannot vanish, where does it go when I sleep?" Another, "What if the laws we believe in only work when we look at them?" These weren't scientific statements, they were childlike. But somewhere between poetry and logic, Niels was building a bridge. His relationship with Harold deepened. They shared books, Greek philosophy, Euclid, Newton. But it wasn't just science. They wrote poetry, short plays. They debated morality. And always, they were whispering questions into the dark. Imagined, letter, future Bohr to young Bohr. You will not always be believed, but believe in the silence. It is where truth hides. In school, Niels was brilliant but introverted. He disliked public speaking. He rarely challenged his instructors. Yet when he submitted his essays, they were different. Not just answers, but architectures of logic. Complex thought poured out like ink from a cracked vial. His father noticed. He encouraged the spark, but never pressed him. Christian believed inquiry must be earned, not demanded. And then, something shifted. When Niels was 15, his father fell gravely ill. The strong, composed Christian began to weaken. His breath grew shallow. Niels, terrified, sat outside the study door for hours. He began writing notes in a secret journal, hidden behind a book on Maxwell's equations. If life can disappear from the strongest man I know, what kind of law governs that? He started questioning everything, not just the physical world, but the moral one. If time moved forward, why did memory feel so fluid? If energy was conserved, why could people waste away? It wasn't grief, it was confusion. Grief would come later. The doctors said Christian might recover, but the family knew it was a matter of time. In the dim bedroom, Christian whispered things to his sons. No grand speeches, just reminders. To listen, to wonder, to forgive. Niels barely spoke for weeks. Then one night, he rose from bed and went outside. He stared at the moon, full and white like an equation unresolved, and he whispered aloud, "Show me what you are." It was unclear whether he was speaking to the moon, to the universe, or to himself. From that day, his notes changed. They became sharper, less poetic, more structured, but they lost none of their mystery. Voiceover. Jim Al-Khalili said, "Bohr had the kind of mind that could dance with paradox. He wasn't afraid of contradiction. He saw it as a sign he was close to something real." In 1903, Niels entered the University of Copenhagen. He would study philosophy, mathematics, and physics. But it wasn't just a curriculum, it was a sanctuary. He would spend hours alone in the university library, reading Faraday, Helmholtz, and obscure journals from German physicists. He took meticulous notes, but more importantly, he wrote questions in the margins. He still didn't talk much in class. One professor recalled, he would stare at the blackboard long after the lecture ended. Then, without looking at me, he'd ask something that turned the entire lesson inside out. That year, Niels wrote a paper on the behavior of water jets and surface tension. It was precise, experimental, elegant. And yet, it contained one line at the end. If the laws we discover are expressions of nature, how do we know nature is not hiding something better? He submitted it. No one responded. It wouldn't be the last time Niels Bohr's genius was met with silence, but by now, he had made peace with it. Imagined letter. Future Bohr to present Bohr. You will live in a world that calls certainty strength. Do not forget, it is in doubt that new worlds are born. As the century turned and the old classical laws of Newton began to tremble under the weight of new observations, one boy in Copenhagen was already preparing to tear the fabric of reality and stitch it back together in a shape no one had ever seen before. Not with force, not with noise, but with a question. What is real? And what is just the shadow of our need to understand? A soft, rhythmic ticking. A train platform in Copenhagen. Rain beads down the side of a glass window. Through it, we glimpse a young man staring blankly into the blur. His coat is too large. His fingers are stained with ink. He holds a folded letter, worn at the edges, as if read 100 times. Every revolution begins in silence, and every great mind must first pass through loneliness. A voice, measured, reflective, emerges as the steam engine exhales behind him. He had no charisma, no dramatic flair, no voice that could command a room, but he had something deeper, a patience for the unknown, and the humility to be wrong, again and again. The voice fades. The platform clears. Niels Bohr boards the train. Destination: nowhere anyone could see coming. The University of Copenhagen was quiet in winter. Snow softened the streets. Inside the physics building, lamps flickered against frostbitten windows. Niels Bohr spent most days there, alone. He was 21 and already something of a ghost. At the university, he moved like an echo, visible but never quite present. Students passed him on stone stairwells. Professors spoke at him, never to him. He scribbled in notebooks no one read, solved equations no one assigned. He wore suits too large, his voice too soft. His brown hair flopped uncertainly above a forehead always furrowed in thought. His professors described him in 2 words: brilliant, but distant. He wasn't a prodigy in the public sense. He was a storm quietly forming in a sealed bottle, and the bottle was nearly out of air. He spent most evenings alone in the university's dusty physics library, not reading textbooks, but tearing through obscure journals in German, English, French, searching for something that hadn't been written yet, and always doubting. "There are too many things," he wrote, "that don't make sense. I keep wondering if the problem is the theory, or me." It was a cold October afternoon in 1904 when Niels first met Margrethe Nørlund. She wasn't like the other girls, nor the other scientists. Margrethe had a quiet clarity about her, not meek, not loud, but firm, like the feeling of being watched kindly. She was visiting the university to see her brother, Niels Erik Nørlund, a rising mathematician. Niels Bohr was introduced over tea. He barely said 2 words. She said 10. But something lingered in the silence. The next day, he left a folded piece of paper on her brother's desk. It read, "Would she perhaps join me for coffee, to discuss mathematics and, perhaps, chess?" She did. It would become their tradition: chess at twilight, tea by the window, and conversations that wandered into realms neither of them had names for yet. "He listens," she wrote to a friend, "as if words are sacred." And Niels, for the first time, began to speak. Their courtship was anything but ordinary. Instead of poetry, he brought her obscure physics riddles. Instead of flowers, she gave him translations of Leibniz and Goethe. They walked through Copenhagen's fog-draped parks, arguing softly about what light truly was. "What if it isn't a wave or a particle?" she once asked. "Then what is it?" "Something else. Something we haven't imagined yet." He looked at her like she had just moved the stars. In their quiet companionship, something rare began to form, a mental partnership. She wasn't just a listener. She was a challenger, a mirror, a conscience, and she believed in him, with a depth that terrified him. In 1906, Niels earned his master's degree, and later a doctorate. His work on surface tension in metals was already attracting whispers in academic circles, but Bohr didn't want whispers. He wanted the truth, the why behind the equations. So he traveled to Cambridge in 1911, hoping to work under the legendary J.J. Thomson, the man who had discovered the electron. But Cambridge was a cathedral of prestige, and Bohr was a stranger from a small academic pond. Thomson barely noticed him. Bohr's theories were met with condescension, even ridicule. His Danish accent made him hard to understand. His ideas were called clumsy, his experiments sloppy. He didn't fight back. He just withdrew. Margrethe received his letters with growing concern. "Perhaps I do not belong here. I feel invisible again." She replied with only one line, "Then find a place where you will not be." That place, as it turned out, was Manchester. In late 1911, through a recommendation from a sympathetic colleague, Bohr relocated to Ernest Rutherford's lab, a more rugged, experimental atmosphere. It was a different world. Where Cambridge was buttoned and formal, Rutherford's lab was kinetic, almost chaotic. Scientists shouted across benches, glass shattered, sparks flew. Equations were scrawled in chalk with no concern for grammar. And in the center of it all, Rutherford himself. Loud, gruff, brilliant. A man who had just upended atomic theory with his gold foil experiment, proving that atoms weren't blobs of positive charge, as Thomson believed, but mostly empty space with a tiny, dense core. Bohr watched Rutherford's lectures with rapt, almost childlike awe. "For the first time," he wrote, "I feel I'm standing near the furnace." But he was still the outsider, the quiet one, the man taking notes in the corner while others debated. At night, he wrote letters to Margaret, describing the madness of the lab, the experiments, the arguments, the smell of burnt copper, but also his loneliness. She sent him a chessboard and a handwritten note. "You are the furnace, Niels. They just haven't felt the heat yet." Then came the moment that changed everything. Rutherford's gold foil experiment, performed by Geiger and Marsden, had shown that atoms were mostly empty space, with a tiny positive nucleus. But that raised a terrifying question. If electrons orbited that nucleus like planets, then why didn't they spiral inward and crash? According to classical physics, they should. And yet, they didn't. The atom, as science understood it, had just collapsed. Bohr sat with Rutherford in a cluttered lab office, surrounded by half-broken equipment and crumpled notes. He listened. He didn't argue. He watched. He absorbed. And slowly, he began to imagine something new, something that would break physics. Bohr listened more than he spoke. He absorbed contradictions like a sponge, and when he finally did speak, it was to say something no one else dared: that the atom does not obey the rules, that it jumps, that it blinks, that it disappears and reappears, that it is, like all of us, uncertain. In Manchester, Niels Bohr had found something he didn't expect, not just the collapse of the classical atom, but the beginning of a question that no one could answer. And in Margrethe, hundreds of miles away in Copenhagen, he had found something else: the belief that silence is not weakness. It is waiting, waiting for a new world to be spoken into being. Bohr, in a dark lab, chalk in hand, alone at midnight. He draws a circle, then another, then a jump. A strange leap between them. He stops. The candle flickers. Bohr whispers to himself, "What if the atom doesn't spiral? What if it leaps?" A new kind of silence fills the room, not the silence of doubt, but of something being born. They say the greatest revolutions begin not with fireworks, but with a whisper, a soft click of recognition, a moment when the world pauses, not because it is loud, but because something has shifted beneath it. In 1912, deep inside a Manchester laboratory, lit only by desk lamps and scattered glass, Niels Bohr felt that shift. Not in the collision of particles or the sound of a breakthrough, but in a single, terrifying thought. What if electrons didn't orbit smoothly around a nucleus at all? What if, instead, they jumped? For centuries, science had trusted in the elegance of continuity. Nature flowed, it did not leap. And yet, standing before a blackboard smeared with chalk dust and doubt, Bohr dared to imagine the unimaginable. The atom, he proposed, did not behave like a miniature solar system. It behaved like something else entirely, something quantum. The idea came not as a flash, but as a slow and agonizing birth. Months of wrestling with Rutherford's experimental results had yielded nothing stable, nothing classical. According to physics, electrons in orbit should spiral inward and crash into the nucleus in mere microseconds. But they didn't. They stayed suspended, like notes in a song with no beginning and no end. Bohr's mind turned inward. What if the atom wasn't a failure of theory, but a hint at a deeper structure? One where electrons leapt between fixed orbits, emitting or absorbing energy only during these quantum jumps. What if the atom was not a place of continuous motion, but of radical silence, interrupted only by sudden, sacred changes? He called it the quantum leap, an electron's instant jump between defined energy levels without traveling the space in between. There was no in-between, no path, just the mystery of before and after. At home, in long letters to Margrethe, he described his visions of orbits and jumps like dreams. She responded not with equations, but with understanding. She didn't pretend to follow every line of mathematics, but she grasped what he truly feared, that no one would believe him. "You're here to ask, not to answer," she told him during one of their winter walks when he returned briefly to Copenhagen. Her voice was calm, her hand in his. "Even if you're wrong the right way." The idea was radical. It contradicted Newton, Maxwell, even Einstein. It was elegant and terrifying. In March of 1913, Bohr began to write, not for glory, not for recognition, but because the silence was becoming unbearable. The model took shape slowly, electrons assigned to discrete orbits with specific energy levels, transitions between them governed by the absorption or emission of quantized energy. A strange, mathematical harmony that finally made sense of spectral lines in hydrogen. It wasn't pure guesswork. Bohr had been influenced deeply by Max Planck's notion of energy quantization and by Einstein's explanation of the photoelectric effect. These ideas were like shadows flickering at the edge of understanding. Now, he reached out and tried to give them shape. He worked in the Manchester lab, scrawling endless drafts. Sheets of equations would pile up by morning, filled with loops and arrows and questions scribbled in the margins. Why n-1? What forbids the in-between? Even Rutherford, now a Nobel laureate and one of the most respected voices in physics, would walk past with raised brows. He admired Bohr's spirit, but he did not see the vision yet. There were moments when Bohr himself nearly abandoned it. The quantum jump was too abstract. It defied common sense. No one had seen such a thing. No one could. Yet somehow, it explained what classical physics could not. By the spring of 1913, he had moved back to Copenhagen and taken up a post at the university, working alone again. But he was not the same. The silence no longer haunted him. It waited, and he wrote. Slowly, carefully, painfully, until a trilogy of papers was completed. On the constitution of atoms and molecules. 3 parts, building one upon the other. He sent the first installment to the Philosophical magazine in England. It was published in July. And then, almost nothing. The world did not tremble. There were no telegrams, no invitations, just a few cautious reviews. Some praised its elegance, others dismissed it entirely. Rutherford, always kind but skeptical, told Bohr his work was too speculative. He encouraged him to keep experimenting. But in one corner of the scientific world, something began to move. A young physicist in Germany named Arnold Sommerfeld read Bohr's paper and was struck silent, then excited, then obsessed. He saw what Bohr had done, and what could still be done. Others followed. And then, the ultimate validation came not from a person, but from a number. When Bohr's model was used to predict the wavelengths of hydrogen's spectral lines, it worked. It fit perfectly, like a code that had been cracked. The Balmer formula, once an empirical curiosity, was now derived from theory. Bohr had reached across the veil and returned with order. Still, public acceptance took time. Some physicists found the quantum leap idea unnerving. It violated all known intuitions. It proposed a universe where matter disappeared and reappeared, where paths were skipped, where causality blurred. Bohr stood by it, not as dogma, but as possibility. At home, Margrethe watched as her husband paced the halls late at night, his slippers worn through at the edges. He would mumble spectral lines to himself or scribble numbers on scraps of paper, occasionally pausing to look out the window, where stars blinked like distant electrons, making their own jumps through the silence. Their marriage was quiet, but intense. Margrethe didn't speak often about physics, but she made sure the house was warm, the tea was steeped, and his mind could roam. When guests arrived, she held conversations gracefully, so Bohr wouldn't have to. When critics doubted him, she sat with him, reading his notes silently. It was a kind of love not based on flattery or celebration, but on holding the invisible tension of belief. Together, they built a home that would soon become a sanctuary for science. But in 1913, it was just the two of them, and a theory. Bohr began to receive invitations, letters from Berlin, Göttingen, and Zurich. Conferences wanted him. Journals wanted more. The silence was breaking. The atom, his atom, had stirred the waters. One night, as summer deepened and the city grew still, he sat with Margrethe in their small study. A breeze moved the curtains. The sound of a piano drifted from a neighbor's window. He held a copy of his published paper in his lap. "I don't know what happens next," he said. "You never do," she replied. And they sat in that moment, not knowing, together. By the end of 1913, the Bohr model had begun its slow transformation from heresy to orthodoxy. And yet, Bohr never lost his doubt. He continued to revise, refine, question. He remained humble, not falsely, but genuinely, because he knew how fragile understanding was. The atom had leapt, yes, but so had he. And somewhere in the quiet of that Copenhagen night, a world began to change. A glass beaker shatters in a quiet room. A puff of chalk dust lingers in the air, as if even the atoms themselves are hesitating. Outside, storm clouds gather above Copenhagen. The year is 1914. War drums echo faintly across Europe, and yet inside a modest Danish office, another kind of tension crackles. A tension not of armies, but of ideas. The air is thick with possibility. Niels Bohr leans over a cluttered desk, surrounded by notes, spectral lines, and unanswered questions. He doesn't look like the founder of a revolution. His tie is askew. His brow is damp. But beneath his quiet exterior, something unshakable is taking root. The Bohr model had cracked the code of hydrogen, yes, but something deeper had been revealed. Not about the atom, but about knowledge itself. Certainty was dead. The age of probabilities had begun. By now, letters from across the scientific world arrive weekly. Some offer admiration, others skepticism. But a few, a rare few, are inquiries from young physicists desperate to work with him. The first came from a brilliant but difficult Austrian named Wolfgang Pauli. The second from a shy, methodical German named Werner Heisenberg. Others would follow. Erwin Schrödinger, Max Born. They weren't students. They were storm fronts, each carrying their own theory, their own contradiction. In 1921, Bohr founded something the world had never seen. An institute not just for research, but for dialogue. A home for uncertainty. The Niels Bohr Institute. Situated near the heart of Copenhagen, the building itself was unassuming. but its rooms buzzed with quiet fury. Ideas collided like electrons, heated debates, scribbled equations, arguments over coffee and chess. There were no uniforms here, no formalities, no final truths. Bohr created a space where no idea was too radical to explore, even if, especially if, it shattered what came before. His principle was simple: science must welcome contradiction, not fear it. Heisenberg arrived in 1924. Only 23, he was already obsessed with the strangeness of quantum behavior. He and Bohr would walk the icy streets of Copenhagen at night, arguing in low voices about the nature of reality. Could a particle exist in more than one place? Could a measurement change the thing it was measuring? Heisenberg was hungry for clarity. Bohr, maddeningly, insisted on ambiguity. From those walks came something radical: the uncertainty principle. Heisenberg published it in 1927, but the idea had been germinating inside those dimly lit corridors for years. That we could never know both a particle's position and momentum with perfect accuracy, not because of our instruments, but because reality itself refused to be pinned down. Pauli, meanwhile, was fierce and perfectionistic. He challenged Bohr's kindness with sharp critiques, calling some of Bohr's metaphors poetic nonsense. Yet Bohr never flinched. He understood that science was not a battle to be won, but a conversation to be deepened. Then came Schrödinger, dashing, charismatic, with wild hair and radical ideas. He detested the probabilistic nature of Bohr's atom. He wanted smooth, deterministic waves, not chaotic jumps. In 1926, he proposed a new model: quantum mechanics as a wave equation, elegant, continuous. But Bohr saw the cracks. He invited Schrödinger to Copenhagen. They debated for days. At one point, Schrödinger fell ill, feverish and frustrated, lying in bed while Bohr sat at his side, explaining why his wave mechanics, beautiful as it was, still couldn't explain the abruptness of quantum jumps. Schrödinger sighed, pulled the blankets tighter. "If we are going to go on with this damned quantum jumping, then I'm sorry I ever started it." Bohr smiled, not unkindly. "But we must, Erwin, because nature does." Amid these storms, Bohr began to shape the principle that would define his legacy: complementarity. That particles can be both waves and particles, not just because we don't know, but because they truly are both, depending on how we look. That the truth depends on the question. That light can act like a wave in one experiment and a particle in another, and both are true. It was not a retreat from reality. It was a surrender to its complexity. The idea was bold and maddening. Einstein, who had once paved the way for quantum theory, now turned against it. He couldn't accept a universe governed by chance. "God does not play dice," he famously said. And so began one of the greatest intellectual rivalries in history. The Bohr-Einstein debates. It began casually, letters exchanged, ideas floated. But soon it became a public contest. At conferences across Europe, Einstein would present thought experiments designed to break quantum theory. One by one, he constructed elegant traps, devices that, in theory, could measure an electron's path without disturbing it. Proof that Bohr was wrong. Bohr, quiet as always, would listen, think, pace, and then, with ruthless precision, dismantle the trap. Not with equations, but with principle. He showed how Einstein's devices still relied on assumptions that quantum physics had already disproven. He would find the flaw, and then explain why the flaw mattered. The most famous clash came at the Fifth Solvay Conference in 1927. 29 of the world's most brilliant minds gathered in Brussels. The photo is iconic. Einstein, Curie, Planck, Heisenberg, Schrödinger, and Bohr, off to the side, quietly watching. Einstein arrived with a series of new thought experiments, confident he could prove that reality was objective, that quantum mechanics was incomplete. He spoke with clarity and conviction. Bohr responded with something quieter, but no less devastating. He didn't just refute Einstein's logic, he changed the frame. Again and again, he showed how Einstein's assumptions couldn't hold in a quantum world. That measurement changes reality, that what we observe depends on how we observe it. And each time, Einstein was forced to retreat, not angrily, but thoughtfully. Bohr wasn't winning with rhetoric. He was winning with humility. In a modern lab, a technician calibrates lasers for a double-slit experiment. A beam of electrons passes through two slits and interferes with itself like a wave. Then a detector is added. The interference vanishes. The electron acts like a particle. It happens again and again. Bohr was right. A voice, perhaps physicist Sean Carroll, narrates, Bohr understood something most of us still struggle with, that the world is not made of things, but of questions. That certainty is a relic of the past. What matters is the act of asking. In the corridors of the Bohr Institute, debates raged on, but so did laughter. So did chess, and shared meals, and long walks in the snow. Bohr created a space not just for minds, but for souls. He never shouted. He rarely published. But he changed the world by hosting a conversation no one else knew how to have. And when the storms passed, when even Einstein nodded in reluctant admiration, Bohr simply smiled. Because for him, the point was never to be right. It was to understand what being wrong really meant. A knock at the door, unmarked and quiet, arrives in the spring of 1933. Outside, the wind carries not just pollen from the gardens of Copenhagen, but the sharp scent of burning paper from Berlin. Books are being destroyed, professorships revoked, names erased. The Reichstag has burned. The flags have changed. But in Bohr's office at the Institute, a new duty awakens. Protect the minds who once dreamed beside him. By now, the Niels Bohr Institute has become more than a laboratory. It's a sanctuary, not just for equations, but for those whose names appear on the wrong lists. Jewish physicists, political dissidents, and academic outcasts. Bohr sees in them not just displaced scholars, but fragments of an idea bigger than science. A belief that thought must remain free, even if bodies are hunted. He helps Leo Szilard, Edward Teller, and others find refuge, calling universities, writing letters, inventing fellowships where none existed. One by one, he guides them out, quietly, carefully, without headlines. In his lectures, he begins to speak in veiled metaphors about boundaries and mirrors, about observation and distortion. The scientists understand. The regime listens but does not. And then, in 1939, fission is discovered in Germany. The atom, Bohr's atom, splits. The news is quiet, almost procedural. But Bohr knows what it means. The energy bound inside a nucleus, once abstract, now becomes a weapon. He confides in Margrethe over a midnight cup of tea. It is not a question of whether, he says, but of who, and how soon. Heisenberg, once his student and walking companion, now works for the Third Reich. Their bond, once unbreakable, is now laced with unease. Letters stop. Then, in 1941, a strange request. Heisenberg wants to visit. The meeting is brief. One evening in occupied Copenhagen. They walk through the park. No one knows exactly what was said, and perhaps even they did not. Here, the story fractures. like a photon encountering a slit. In the first version, Heisenberg pleads with Bohr for understanding. He is trapped, he says, pressured to build the bomb, but trying to delay it. He hopes Bohr can reassure him that such a weapon will never be built, that physicists will refuse. In the second version, Bohr recoils. He hears a veiled threat, a warning, that Germany will win, and Heisenberg wants Bohr's silence. Trust breaks. They part as strangers. In the third version, they say almost nothing. They walk in silence, their history echoing between them. The trees blur past. The wind carries the weight of their choices. 3 versions. One truth. Uncertainty, not just in physics, but in memory. Years later, Bohr would write an unsent letter to Heisenberg, trying to make sense of that night. He never mailed it. Some questions cannot be measured. The war tightens. In 1943, after Denmark's resistance helps evacuate Jewish families to Sweden, Bohr is warned that the Gestapo is coming for him, not because he is Jewish, but because he shelters too many who are. With help from the resistance, he flees to Sweden, then to Britain. There, a new offer awaits. Join the Manhattan Project. Work with the Americans. Build the bomb before Hitler does. Bohr hesitates, but eventually he agrees. Not to build it, but to advise. To ensure it is used only once. To make sure the world sees what it can do, and never dares again. He arrives in Los Alamos under a pseudonym, Nicholas Baker. The desert heat oppresses him. The American scientists admire him, but find him maddeningly abstract. Feynman jokes that Bohr's explanations sound like poetry. Oppenheimer, already haunted, sees Bohr as a kind of moral mirror. Bohr speaks often of limits, of what science can know, and what it must never attempt to know too well. Then, in 1945, the first bomb is tested. The desert blooms with fire. A shockwave flattens the earth. The sand becomes glass. Bohr stands apart from the others. He doesn't cheer. He doesn't speak. In his diary that night, he writes only one sentence. It is done. And now it begins. Hiroshima follows. Then Nagasaki. Bohr collapses. In grief, in guilt, in disbelief. At the institute in Copenhagen, he wanders the halls like a ghost. He speaks little. The blackboards remain half erased. Margrethe finds him one morning, sitting in the garden with a crumpled newspaper. The headline is bold, the photo unmistakable. A city reduced to shadow. "What have we done?" he asks. She doesn't answer. In the months that follow, Bohr shifts from scientist to prophet. He writes to Churchill, to Truman, to Stalin, urging transparency, cooperation, nuclear openness. He dreams of a world where the atom unites, not divides. But the Cold War has begun. No one listens. And in the midst of this storm, a quiet footstep behind him. Aj Bohr, his son, returns from his own studies. Brilliant, composed, but carrying a question. Can one inherit both genius and burden? Father and son begin to work together, but something tugs at the edge. Attention. Aj is precise. Bohr is philosophical. Their disagreements are gentle, but cutting. The institute is no longer just a home. It is a stage, a shadow, a legacy being passed forward. One day, Aj finds an old letter, the one Bohr wrote to Heisenberg but never sent. He reads it in silence. Later, over coffee, he asks his father, "Would you have written it differently if the world had changed?" Bohr thinks for a long time. "No," he says, "but I would have mailed it." A voice, Sabine Hossenfelder, perhaps, cuts in. Physics doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in time, in fear, in faith, in men with trembling hands. The world after 1945 is no longer the same. And neither is Bohr. A man walks through a corridor lined with glass. On each side, silence. The chalkboards are blank, the desks abandoned. Once, this hall rang with arguments about electrons, about duality, about uncertainty. Now, only his footsteps remain. This is Niels Bohr in 1946, returned from war, returned from prophecy, but no longer certain where he belongs. The war is over. The world has split, not just atomically, but ideologically. And Bohr, once at the center of the greatest scientific upheaval in history, now finds himself alone in a world that speaks a different language. The physicists he helped raise are building new theories, faster machines, closed secrets. And Bohr? Bohr writes letters. His vision is simple, yet impossible. What he calls the open world. A doctrine where nuclear knowledge is shared, transparently, mutually, globally. Not as weaponry, but as warning. Not as secrecy, but as trust. He meets with Churchill, who waves him off. He writes to Truman, who never responds. He tries Moscow. The Cold War has already frozen over. No one will listen to the man with open hands. And so, Bohr becomes something stranger, a philosopher in exile. Still working, still thinking, but adrift. He publishes essays that blend science and ethics, quantum logic, and human frailty. Few read them. Fewer understand them. The headlines have moved on to hydrogen bombs, satellites, red scares. Younger physicists, the new generation, grow restless with his ambiguity. They want precision, predictions, clean equations. Hugh Everett proposes a bold alternative, the many worlds interpretation. No more mystery, no more collapse. Every quantum outcome happens, somewhere. Reality doesn't choose, it branches. Bohr is troubled, not because he resents new thinking, but because he sees in it a loss of humility. A return to classical certainty, cloaked in quantum costume. He tries to respond, to refine his complementarity principle, but the debate shifts around him. The room he once commanded now moves without him. He walks alone more often. Through the institute, through the gardens, along the cold streets of Copenhagen. Observers pass him, barely recognizing the man who reshaped the atom. But inside, he is still searching, still asking. Aj is now a physicist in his own right. He wins awards, publishes papers, but the shadow remains. Whenever he enters the lecture hall, there is a pause, an expectation that he will speak like his father, think like his father, doubt like his father. He doesn't. One night, Aj confronts him. It is quiet. A kettle boils in the background. "You taught the world that certainty is a trap," Aj says, "but you've built a temple around your uncertainty. It's beautiful and suffocating." Bohr doesn't respond, not right away. Later, alone, he rereads Everett's paper. His hands tremble slightly. He sees in it a kind of bravery and a kind of forgetting. That science is not just prediction, it is interpretation, risk, language, silence. Margaret watches him drift further. He eats less, sleeps less, speaks only when spoken to. One evening, she finds him alone in the lab, staring at a beam of light passing through a slit. "You whisper to ghosts now," she says. Her voice is soft, but not gentle. "Your students, your lost friends, yourself." He looks at her, eyes red. They're the only ones who listen. But even ghosts grow quiet. He lectures again, occasionally. His voice still carries weight, but less force. His blackboards stay cleaner longer. When a journalist asks him about many worlds, he only smiles. "It's not wrong," he says. "It's just unasked." Carlo Rovelli's voice layered softly. Bohr understood that knowledge is not a conquest, it is a conversation. That truth is not a fixed point, but a space between perspectives. His humility was not weakness, it was discipline. By 1957, Bohr is still at the Institute, still reading, still writing. But the world moves faster now. Particles spin in accelerators he doesn't visit. Nations posture over missiles he warned against. And yet, in a small office by the sea, an old man writes another letter. Not to a government, not to a physicist, but to himself. It begins simply. What is it we truly know, when we know anything at all? A door creaks open before dawn. Niels Bohr stands in his kitchen, watching water boil for tea. The house is quiet. Outside, the sea whispers its tides against the Copenhagen shore. For the first time in years, the world feels still. Not because the questions have gone quiet, but because he has stopped shouting at them. This is 1958. The age of quantum wars has passed. The atom has spoken. And Bohr, weary prophet, is beginning to say goodbye. Something has shifted. Aj visits more often now. Their conversations are less tense, more human. They talk not just of orbits and uncertainties, but of music and mothers and what it means to stand in the shadow of a century. The edge between them has softened. The silence once swollen with expectation now hums with shared grief. Margrethe, ever watchful, notices it. One evening, after dinner, she watches father and son play chess. No tension, no testing, just pieces moving slowly, carefully, under a single dim lamp. She lets the moment breathe. Occasionally, Bohr chuckles now. He reads to Aj from old letters, some from Einstein, others from colleagues long dead. They laugh at the stubbornness of youth, at the tortured metaphors they once used to describe electrons. The past is no longer a ghost. It's a story they tell each other. In early 1959, Bohr makes a quiet journey. He travels to Princeton, walks slowly through the cemetery where Einstein lies buried. There is no one else there, no reporters, no students, just wind and leaf and stone. He kneels, rests a trembling hand on the simple marker. "You never believed in dice," he murmurs. "I never believed in certainty." A pause. But we were both right, and both terribly alone. In the nights that follow, dreams begin to return. Not nightmares, not revelations, but soft flickers. Childhood walks with Harold, the smell of chalk, the sound of dry leaves in the Copenhagen wind. He dreams of his mother's piano, of the way light refracted through stained glass in his childhood church. He dreams of electrons, but not the ones he spent a life explaining. These electrons are soft, playful, mysterious. They dance. They laugh. They leave no trails. He stops writing public papers. The final manuscripts are private. Fragments of thought, letters to Margrethe he never sends. A list of questions with no answers. A sketch of a wave function shaped like a child's spiral drawing. And then, a cough that doesn't go away. In the spring of 1962, the diagnosis comes. Quietly, unceremoniously. He doesn't tell many, but Margrethe knows. So does Aj. They don't discuss it. They don't need to. The walks grow slower. The lab visits rarer. One night, Aj finds him asleep in the Institute's library. A book still open beside him. Lucretius's On the Nature of Things. the margin filled with soft pencil notes, arrows pointing to lines about atoms and void, about beauty born of chaos. "I wanted to start at the beginning," Bohr says, waking slowly, "before I ever asked what was knowable." His final months are gentle. Visitors come and go. Feynman writes a short letter. Irreverent, fond. Heisenberg sends a cryptic postcard, an old joke they once shared about billiard balls and bad math. A photo of Einstein sits by the window. The sea grows colder. In the final week, Bohr barely speaks. Margrethe reads to him. Old poetry, fragments of Rilke and Hafiz. Aj sits in the chair by the door, listening to his father's breath like a metronome slowly winding down. One night, during a particularly clear evening, Bohr wakes. He asks for the window to be opened. Outside, the stars burn gently over the city. The institute stands quiet in the distance, the same building where he once defined an age. He turns to Margrethe. "There's a thought," he says, "but it's too small for words." She nods. And then he sleeps. On November 18, 1962, Niels Bohr dies. That night, the institute holds a candlelit vigil. Students, colleagues, children, some who knew him, many who didn't, gather in the lecture hall. A single candle burns at the front. The blackboard behind it reads only one phrase: "Truth lives in the question." A silent hour passes. Outside, the wind turns the trees. Inside, Aj walks slowly to the front. He doesn't speak. Instead, he picks up a piece of chalk and draws an orbit. One circle, no electrons, just space. Carlo Rovelli's voice returns. Bohr was the final electron, not crashing, not collapsing, but leaping into mystery, into stardust, into the unknown that called him all his life. The screen fades, not to black, but to stars. Particles scatter, light bends, and the question, still unanswered, remains. A blackboard flickers into view. The chalk dust hangs in the air like memory, but the hands that once filled it with symbols are gone. It's 1963 now. The candles from Bohr's vigil have long since burned out, but the questions he posed, the ones he refused to answer too quickly, still echo in the corridors of physics, in the language of qubits and parallel paths, in the flicker of laboratory lights late at night. The years after Bohr's death did not bring closure. They brought confusion. Quantum theory, once held in a delicate philosophical tension under Bohr's careful hands, now splinters. The Copenhagen interpretation, once gospel, begins to face revolt. Young theorists push back against its vagueness, its evasions. If the act of measurement defines reality, what of the world unmeasured? What of consciousness? What of parallel realities? Hugh Everett's many worlds theory gains traction. David Bohm reintroduces hidden variables, arguing that particles may have well-defined trajectories beneath the veil of uncertainty. John Bell formulates inequalities that turn those questions into experimental tests. The atom, once Bohr's domain of ambiguity and balance, becomes a battlefield again. Bohr's name is invoked like scripture, revered, misquoted, challenged. Meanwhile, in dim labs around the world, physicists begin exploring questions Bohr could only have imagined. Can a particle be entangled across galaxies? Can we compute with the very uncertainty he once defended? By the 1980s, talk of quantum computers begins to emerge. Feynman proposes machines that operate on probabilities, not bits. In the shadows of Silicon Valley, young scientists write code that reflects not logic, but Bohr's ghost. Algorithms where observation collapses states, where entanglement is not magic, but engineering. Quantum teleportation, long a fantasy, is demonstrated. Not objects, but states. Information. A photon's properties leaping from one place to another without crossing space. As if reality is not what moves, but what reconfigures. In these breakthroughs, Bohr's fingerprints remain, even if smudged. His insistence on humility, on the primacy of questions, becomes foundational, even as others claim new answers. But not all echoes are hopeful. The Cold War turns quantum theory, Bohr's delicate dance of ambiguity, into a skeleton key for power. Nuclear arsenals expand. Atomic secrets spread through espionage. The moral questions Bohr raised at Los Alamos are buried beneath doctrine and threat. Scientists who once studied under him now build systems meant to destroy continents. Bohr's image, once that of a fatherly philosopher, is carved into monuments, placed in textbooks, institutionalized. But something human fades. The twinkle, the paradox, the doubt. In classrooms, his name is followed by equations, not silences. And yet, not entirely. There are moments. In a dusty university lecture hall, a student stares too long at the double-slit diagram and asks, "But how does it know?" In a quantum research lab, a postdoc halts an experiment, pauses, and whispers, "Wait, what are we actually observing?" In these flickers, these half-formed questions, Bohr lives. Voiceovers from physicists around the world fade in over archival footage. Sean Carroll. He was maddening. He never gave you the answer you wanted, only the one you hadn't yet thought to ask. Sabine Hossenfelder. Bohr made uncertainty not just a calculation, but a philosophy. That's terrifying and beautiful. Carlo Rovelli. We are still living in his world, even when we try to leave it. Cut to a series of haunting images, empty labs, flickering lights over abandoned cyclotrons, blackboards half erased as if someone was interrupted mid-thought. Old film reels of Bohr walking the corridors of the Institute, alone, slow, barely touching the railings. And then, a child stands in front of a museum display. Bohr's handwritten notes behind glass. She presses her hand against it, puzzled. Her father whispers, "He was the man who said no one truly understands quantum mechanics." The girl, "Then why do we still try?" Fade to darkness, but not silence. A final whisper. Did Bohr misunderstand the atom, or did we misunderstand Bohr? Oj was awarded in 1975 for his own work in nuclear physics, but when asked about it years later at a press event in the 1990s, he said quietly, "This isn't about equations, it's about my father's silence." Bohr's death had not ended the uncertainty. It had passed it on. In the decades that followed, Bohr's name scattered across disciplines like stardust across a vacuum. But instead of solidifying, his legacy fractured. Physicists, philosophers, engineers, and even poets each claimed a piece of him, and often misunderstood the whole. Quantum theorists pushed further into interpretation, chasing not just answers, but realities. Everett's many worlds became mainstream in some circles, a universe where every possibility plays out. The Copenhagen interpretation, Bohr's interpretation, was now called conservative, even evasive. And yet, in the emerging fields of quantum computing, Bohr's ghost remained. Engineers working on entangled processors whispered about superpositions with the same reverence he once gave to slits and shadows. Startups promised quantum speedups while quoting Bohr in sleek whiteboard videos. In Silicon Valley boardrooms, executives spoke of uncertainty not as caution, but as innovation. Bohr's words, or versions of them, were stamped on slide decks. Prediction is only meaningful if we accept the limits of measurement. Reality is not what is, but what we can know. Did he say these things? Not always, but his fingerprints blurred across everything. In tech labs experimenting with quantum AI, researchers mimicked entangled states in neural networks, invoking Bohr as a prophet of future cognition. One paper declared, "Our AI is uncertain in a Bohr-like way." What that meant, no one could say. And outside of science, in art, in literature, Bohr's name became myth. A play staged in Berlin presented Bohr as a ghost who haunts a particle accelerator, speaking only in riddles. A sculpture garden in Kyoto used quantum equations and Bohr quotes carved into obsidian. An installation in Venice titled "The Silence of Superposition" filled a room with whispering voices reading Bohr's letters, over and over. Even philosophers found themselves arguing with his shadow. Derrida invoked complementarity in discussions of deconstruction. Modern epistemologists cited Bohr as a harbinger of postmodern science, but whether they agreed or not, they always circled the same enigma. Was Bohr merely being cautious, or was he warning us of something deeper? Parallel interviews flash across the screen. A young physicist in Toronto. Bohr limited us. The Copenhagen view is too timid. A philosopher in Paris. He saved us from arrogance. That matters more than math. A quantum engineer in Zurich. His uncertainty is the only certainty we still have. In a quiet room, preserved in the archives of the Niels Bohr Institute, lies a box. Inside, Margrethe's final letters, never published, never read publicly. One of them begins, "You believed the world could be explained, but you lived as though it never could." Another ends, "Even when you left us, you never really arrived. You remained an orbit, a presence, a pull." She had outlived him by 15 years, but her voice, too, fades quietly in the margins of history, as if echoing his restraint. Back in the classroom, the students still argue. They study the delayed choice quantum eraser. They talk about superdeterminism. They bring up Bohr, always Bohr, and wonder what he would say today. One student, arms folded, says, "He didn't answer anything." Another replies, after a beat, "Maybe that was the answer." In a final commentary, modern physicist Sean Carroll, or Ravelli, said, "He didn't solve the mystery. He made it eternal. That is not failure. That is art." It is the year 2123. We are no longer in Copenhagen, no longer in the 20th century. A child walks into a classroom suspended above the earth, a quiet, gleaming satellite school orbiting in low light. The walls shimmer, the floor is translucent, the ceiling a slow rotation of stars. This is not the classroom of Bohr's time, but it is still haunted by his question. The child moves to her desk. A holographic sphere rises, slow, luminous, soft. Inside, a single atom of hydrogen begins to unfold. One proton, one electron, but no certainty. The electron doesn't spin in circles. It flickers, it pulses, it dances across a probability cloud. A teacher's voice rises around the room. "This," the voice says, "was once called an orbit, but Niels Bohr knew better." Images ripple through the air. Bohr's face, grainy and young, then older and heavier, then gone. Equations dissolve like breath on glass. Then a quote, suspended in the room like scripture. "Every statement I make must be understood not as an affirmation, but as a question." The students are silent, not because they understand, but because they feel the depth of not understanding. Another voice now, gentler, not the teacher, not the system, but perhaps a memory itself. Niels Bohr believed in the pause between thought and speech. He made silence a tool of truth. He didn't claim to explain the atom. He taught us how to sit beside it without knowing. The child raises her hand. Why didn't he just say what it was? A pause, then the reply. Because the atom is a mirror, and the moment you name it, you name yourself. Outside, the earth rotates below, slow and blue. In a corner of the room, a preserved artifact, Bohr's original drawing of the atom, etched in aged glass. A classmate approaches it. She doesn't touch it. She just watches. The flicker of the electron within it seems to twitch in response. Fade. The hologram dims. Now, a zoom out. The hydrogen atom, luminous, collapses inward and then expands outward. Past the satellite, past the planet, into the solar system, into the galaxy, into the cosmic web. A dance of matter and uncertainty, born of probability and flame. Each orbit echoes his question. Each flicker, a hesitation before knowing. The music fades, not to silence, but to a quantum pulse. A heartbeat that slows and fragments, not disappearing, but dissolving. And in the final moment, as the stars bloom into a soft infinite, a whisper. And still, he listens, in silence, in infinity.